We are going to be streaming here on social media, on Facebook and YouTube. Good evening, everybody. And we will get our music started. We're going to let everybody in. Graham, thanks for being here.
Yeah. Should I turn my computer off or just or my camera off, or I don't know.
No, yeah, keep it
it's
on.
All right there. Perfect.
Oh yeah. We're ready to go. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Veterans Breakfast Club's Greatest Generation Live for Thursday, June 5th. My name is Sean Hall. I'm the Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club, and our mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. We've been doing this for 16 years, and we invite you all to check out our website, www.veteransbreakfastclub.org, to find out more there is to know about us, about all of our upcoming online programs, our in-person programs. Next week is our busiest week of the summer for VBC. I'm going to get into all of the programs that we have scheduled for next week. We're hoping that you join us for all of them because they're all great. But tonight we have Glenn Flickinger. We're going to be talking about Eisenhower. Is that correct, Glenn?
We're going to talk about the man who led the D-Day invasion, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, better known as Ike, I think everybody knows. So let me introduce our guest for tonight. He is direct from New York City, Michel Paradis. Michel, please say hello.
Hey, how's it going? Pleasure to see you all.
Okay. It's great to have you on tonight, Michel. Michel has a French-Canadian background, ergo the French name. But he lived in Pittsburgh, so
I did.
As a very young toddler type age, right?
Yeah, till about the age of 5, and then my family, my mother and I moved out to basically in and around Allentown, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
So I can, as you all will know and understand, having the name Michel, either in Pittsburgh or in essentially Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania, in the 1980s was something to make you tough.
Yes. Well, it would do you a lot of good tonight with this audience to throw in a Yuns every once in a while.
That's
right. Make everybody feel at home. So
I got some water. I got some water here. I'll be fine.
Yeah. So let me give you a little background on how I got a hold of Michel. So about a year ago, I was in a bookstore, and it was around this time of year, so a lot of books out on D-Day. It was the 80th anniversary then. And I ran across this, and I think I'd seen it online at one of my book club things I belong to. And my first thought was, oh no, another book on Eisenhower. What else is there to say about this man that hasn't been said 100 times, right? So I was, just as often happens, I was so wrong, because I picked up the book, went and got a cup of coffee and looked through it, and I was immediately mesmerized by it because of the way Michel tells this story. First of all, it's only about 2 years of Eisenhower's life. At least it focuses on those 2 years. And the way he structures this story, to me, was just fascinating. So, Michel, what led you to, well, first of all, tell us about you and your background and what led you to write this book the way that you did.
Sure, that's a really good question. So, as I mentioned, I grew up in Pennsylvania. Went off to school and ended up writing my first book on something on which I'd worked. So I worked in for a very long time, including for the Department of Defense, essentially war crimes prosecutions. And so my first book was about the prosecution of Japanese war criminals after the Second World War, particularly a case involving the torture and murder of the Doolittle Raiders. And so that's my first book from 2020. Last Mission to Tokyo makes a great gift in advance of Father's Day, I will add, as does The Light of Battle. And so that was probably my big entree into like the world of World War II literature, right? I'd grown up obviously reading World War II books, seeing World War II movies. But in doing some of the podcasts and whatnot during COVID for that book, you get to know all the other books that are being written and talked about. And the thing that struck me most as someone who was a bit naive to the genre was how few books were being written about Eisenhower. right out. Like there were a couple books about Churchill and Patton going around at the time. MacArthur gets a book. Truman is a ready subject for a lot of people. And it struck me as odd because I thought that Eisenhower, I knew him as a kid, like as the guy on the silver dollar, and as, an American president, but I did also know, like, he led, the actual defeat of the actual Nazis, and, D-Day and all that. And it just kind of struck me that no one seemed to think he was interesting enough to write about. And probably the contrarian side of my brain suggested to me that there was something there that people were missing. And the more I dug into it, the more my initial hypothesis or suspicion, was proven just wildly correct. Because here you have someone who grew up in one of the remotest parts of the United States, Abilene, Kansas, and it's still far. It's the middle of the country. It's about as far away as you can be from almost anything. As the middle child of essentially subsistence farmers, who were religiously pacifist, being a part of a evangelical, essentially mystical branch of what become the Jehovah's Witnesses. So they're anti-military, anti-government. Who goes on to not only go to West Point, and become a general, and then become one of the most important, if not the most powerful military figure in all of human history, in terms of just the amount of power at his disposal and the scale of his victory. But then goes on to be the most consequential political leader, I would say, of certainly the second half of the 20th century. And the only explanation anyone ever would give for me, that I only could sort of find in some of the biographies or articles about him was, well, he had good values, came from a good home and worked hard and, lived the American dream. And that's not wrong, but I was like, there has to be more to it than that. And the more I dug into him, the more I realized how much there was to him, how interesting he was, because, he has this public persona that I certainly grew up with, of being, the dad from the 1950s, literally the father's knows best type
Yeah,
figure, mayonnaise on white bread.
That's a great analogy. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like aggressively boring in some ways. And like simple-minded too, right? Like you people, oh, he's empty-headed playing golf all the time. And I just figured that can't be true because, not just because of his political success, but of where he had to go and how he pulled it off in a world full of the most savvy, amazing political, operators also of human history, right? Hitler, Stalin, Roosevelt, Churchill, de Gaulle, right? Like there are reams, shelves of books written about all of these people because of their political leadership and their impact on human history in the 20th century. And Eisenhower was kind of always just this, he just happened to be, he was like a cameo in all these stories. And something that, I don't know, that just tipped me off that there was a real story here that had been overlooked. And that's what I tried to do with the book.
Right. Right. And then the structure of the book. So what I liked about it immediately when I had that cup of coffee and opened it, each chapter is kind of dedicated to a different person who influenced Eisenhower. And many of those people wrote about Eisenhower, their own memoirs, whatever, many of which I've had the pleasure to read. And your thought was rather than, and there is a deep biographical, set of books on Eisenhower. You didn't go to those books. You went to these people who were influencers, use a term, which Eisenhower probably rolling over in his grave right now. That word. And wrote it from about Eisenhower from their point of view. Do I have that stated correctly?
Yeah, that was because, I realized that a big part of Eisenhower was, this again, this very benign self-presentation. And I focused, one of the things that it's easy to forget was almost revolutionary, is Eisenhower's smile, right? Like think about any general you've ever seen in history from before then. Now, can you think of a photograph, particularly like a public posed photograph, of them smiling at you?
Yeah.
Like Grant, right? Like certainly not Churchill. Like look for a picture of Churchill smiling. Even FDR, who had sort of who was known for his kind of bonhomie, like his official portraits are stern, right? Like there's a sternness to politics at that time. Um, that Eisenhower really broke through, and I think understanding a very kind of modern understanding of politics, a real small d democratic politics, where, you know, as people increasingly had their as people increasingly had a say in how they lived their lives and who their leaders were, there was actually a real political power in being seen as and being really, just like them, a guy who they'd want to have a beer with is kind of what we'd say today. And that actually makes Eisenhower very difficult to write about because he understood, I think, early in his bones that if he had that same sort of stern public presentation, both in the internal politics within the army, certainly the diplomatic politics of World War II, and then certainly when he's, an actual, capital P political figure in the United States, that um, that he would, inspire resistance, suspicion, competition, and that his smile was actually a very potent weapon to have people underestimate him and not realize what he was up to, or to take him seriously until it was too late, right? Until he had more or less gotten his way. Um, and so that actually makes writing about Eisenhower extremely challenging because he was always very disciplined in giving you that personal persona, especially in his books. The only kind of exception in his published writing that I would even point to is a book he wrote very much towards the end of his life, which is very funny. And it's called Just Stories I Tell My Friends. And it's really just a series of like personal anecdotes that he's literally recounting into a dictaphone, and having transcribed. And that's like the most intimate and I think kind of honest, writing that he ever does for publication.
Yeah.
And so if you really want to understand Eisenhower, I think it's important to peel away as much of that public persona as possible.
Yeah.
And the way I realized you could do that is by who influenced him, who was around him, how did he grow into this person from there? How did he get from A to B? And it was through other people, and picking up on them, their influence, what to do, what not to do, that he ultimately becomes the kind of person he is. So that was really my strategy. I wanted to really understand this guy, and I realized the best way to do that was to not ask him, but to ask the people around him what he was like.
Yeah, yeah, and you succeed greatly. And what we're going to do, I'm going to ask Michel to be on pause here for about 5 minutes. What we're going to do is talk about 7 or 8 of those people who influenced him.
Sure.
There's 30 plus of them in the book. We don't have time to cover them all. So Michel and I kind of agreed on who the top sort of half dozen were, and we'll go from there. But Michel, if I can just sort of pause our conversation for a while. So it is the 81st anniversary of D-Day tomorrow, and I need to actually share the PowerPoint I have here. I totally forgot about that part, but Todd or Sean, you need to give me the ability to share.
Will do. 1 second, Glenn. Sorry about that.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. So being the anniversary or near the anniversary tomorrow, obviously the anniversary for D-Day, I was really excited to be able to have Michel on the program, but I didn't want to miss the opportunity to share a few names and honor a few of the men who, over the years, mostly Todd, has interviewed on the Veterans Breakfast Club. This is by far not a complete list, but I just thought I would honor a few of the names that I personally could just come up with, and Todd contributed. And of course, the first one is a man who is still with us, who we all know quite well, and that's Warren Goss from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, who was on D-Day on Utah Beach at D-Day. He was, as many of you know, with a combat engineer battalion. He was a rifleman, so he landed before the first wave landed. And many of you know him personally. He comes to many of our events. He doesn't come online very often. He's not a internet kind of guy. He's 100 years old now. And a couple of months ago, Todd and I and 30 other VBC people had the honor of being with him at the World War II Museum in New Orleans for 2 days, 4 days in New Orleans, 2 days at the museum. And of course, he was greeted as a, conquering hero by the museum. It's just been a great pleasure to get to know Warren, a man who was there. And not only was there, but like some of these other men I'm going to mention, fought from D-Day through to the end of the war, near the end of the war. He actually never won a Purple Heart, although he was concussed pretty badly. And there's this famous clip, and I'm going to guess, Michelle, you've seen this clip. People don't know it, but this is.
Told is not by the order.
So the man in front with the hand grenade in his hand is Warren Goss. And you see this clip on just about every documentary done on D-Day. I'll play it again. I asked Warren, I said, well, Warren, how did you figure that out? He goes, well, I didn't. My mom and sister did, because they went to the the movies, and they would play the news clips at the movies, and this was a news clip they played. And the minute that it was shown, his mom said, "That's my son. That's my son." So we actually mentioned that down at the D-Day Museum, and we're trying to get more of the footage because there has to be a little bit earlier and a little bit later as well. I asked Warren, because he's got this hand grenade in his hand. I said, Warren, how many hand grenades did you throw that day? He goes, I can't even remember. I threw every hand grenade I had, I threw. So that's the first man I want to honor that we know. The second is Henry Parham, who was one of the few Black veterans, African-American veterans of Omaha Beach. And he landed with the 320th Anti-Aircraft Balloon Battalion, putting up these anti-aircraft balloons. And Henry was a Pittsburgher, and Henry passed away just in the past year, I believe. Does anybody remember that correctly, Sean? I think just in the past year, Henry passed.
Yes, and within the past year or so.
Yeah, so we want to certainly honor Henry. And then two other men who passed a decade ago. These are people that Todd interviewed, 15 years ago or so. These are men I've seen their interviews, I've read the transcripts. We're working on some stories about them. Frank Gervasi with the Big Red One. One of those men, like another man we're going to be talking about a little bit later in the month, Bernie Friedenberg, who was with the Big Red One and landed at every one of their amphibious landings: North Africa, Sicily, Omaha Beach, and then fought through most of the battle for Europe. Another fascinating interview, and a fascinating man who was one of there's a book, I'm going to blank out on the author, someone else might remember it for me, called The Boys Crusade. And you got to remember, these are all boys. These were, Warren Goss was 19 years old when he hit Omaha Beach. All these guys, or Utah Beach, all these men were young men, teenagers, maybe 20, 21. And then another fascinating interview is Joe Zimbicki, 90th Infantry Division, Utah Beach. Now, he did land on D-Day +2. I point out these men, and there's probably a half a dozen more if I'd have done a little bit more research, that especially Todd has interviewed over the years. And I just want us to remember what these men did, because as many of our vets say all the time, freedom is not free. And these men made it. Many of their colleagues, many of them will mention their comrades who did not make it. So I'm going to pause the slideshow for a moment, because next we're going to go into the more detailed discussion with Michel and just see if there's any comments on any of these men or anything about Michel so far that we'd like to address. Any questions of Michel? Going once.
I saw one question here. Who nominated him? Excuse me. Who nominated him to West Point? It's actually a funny story, and I recount a lot of it in the book. I won't give you belabor it all now. But Eisenhower wanted to go to West Point since he was a boy. And those were there were two reasons for it, really. One was he became in love with the idea of being a general and going to West Point, from things like the Saturday Evening Post, where West Point had its centennial, and there were a lot of spreads about sort of what plebe life was like that Eisenhower sort of got at the perfect age, which was about 10 or 11 years old. The other was West Point had a just dominating football team at the turn of the 20th century, and college football was even bigger then than it is now, if you can believe that, because there was no real pro football yet. And so Eisenhower had always pined to go to West Point, but it was sort of a secret, a personal secret, in part because obviously his parents would not have approved, but didn't have any political connections, right? He literally came from nowhere. And but a friend of his who had gone away to boarding school, they'd gone to the same middle school, they had a wealthy father from the nice side of Abilene, who had gotten into Annapolis, but had failed the entrance exam. And so had to go back home to Abilene to study up. And Eisenhower reconnected with this old friend, who basically was like, yeah, you just got to like reach out to Senator Bristow and see if he'll nominate you. And Eisenhower was like, you and I come from very different stock. Basically, I am not part of like Abilene's or Kansas's sort of Republican Party tradition. And but just so happened Senator Bristow, called for an exam. And so Eisenhower wrote to Bristow and basically said, hey, I want to take this entrance exam. And Bristow said, well, the newspapers kind of over-reported my commitment to meritocracy here, but sure, kid, I'll let you take it. And Eisenhower worked really hard. He got letters from local businessmen, Republican businessmen, to send to Bristow. And then he took the exam and scored second. And so there were three or four places Bristow could do to both West Point and the Naval Academy. And the guy who scored first wanted to go to the Naval Academy, so Eisenhower got to go to West Point.
Yep. Great story. I mean, really one of the great American, if you will, rags to riches story, at least rags to fame.
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe not riches. Yeah.
Yeah, no riches. That he never pursued money. He liked a comfortable life. Like he had his beautiful house in Gettysburg. He liked good food and stuff. His home cooking notwithstanding. But he never was motivated by money, and he turned away so many opportunities. Literally, people throwing what in the modern equivalent of millions of dollars at him to kind of sell out. And he never took it.
Yeah. Okay, we'll march on. Let me pull this PowerPoint back up and show you a few of the photos of the people that Michel writes about in his book that heavily influenced the development of Ike. Let me also say, I meant to say this earlier. Here's this iconic picture of Eisenhower on the eve of D-Day, visiting the 101st Airborne Division. You see him there with the 4 stars. The expression on his face and on the men behind him, I just priceless. And I just wanted to start with this because this actually is sort of the end of our story. Now we're going to go backwards. But I also wanted to say, as we think about how to remember D-Day, it goes the way I personally kind of view history, and I love viewing it this way with World War II. You can study the Eisenhowers, the Churchills, the de Gaulles of the story of World War II. Obviously, that's at the highest political and military leadership level. But then you can also study the men I just mentioned, the guys that were down in the foxholes, and that's and everybody in between. And that's what I love to understand when you talk to Warren Goss as a 18, 19-year-old young man going to war. He had no idea of the larger picture, right? Many of these men were innocents, if you will, relative to geopolitics, to the world at large, especially in the late 30s and early 40s. So trying to understand, how it is that Warren Goss and these other men, ended up in that foxhole. Who put him there? Well, this is the man who put him there, at least relative to the invasion of Normandy, along with a lot of other people who influenced Eisenhower. And that's what we're going to get into next. So the first person we're going to pull up, I'm going to guess not too many of you are going to recognize. General Fox Connor. Michel, I got some bullet points here, but you want to give us a little background on Fox Connor and why he's so important to Eisenhower's story?
Yeah, Fox Connor is one of the great underappreciated figures of the early 20th century army. Really, the army that fought World War II would not exist without Fox Connor. He was an aide to General Pershing during the First World War. a key military planner and military theorist. He was the son of a blinded Confederate veteran from Mississippi, but committed himself to a life first going to West Point in a military life where he became just a savant of military history. He spoke at least German and French, read the histories of like Clausewitz, whether or not it's Clausewitz or the French histories in their native language, and ends up becoming a mentor to several people whose names you're going to hear over the course of this discussion. And I'm sure you've heard before, people like George Marshall, Patton, and ultimately Eisenhower. And for reasons we can talk about more, Eisenhower meets Fox Connor at probably the lowest single point in his entire life. And Fox Connor is not a warm and fuzzy figure, the way you might think of great mentors. Fox Connor destroyed all of his papers to make it extremely difficult for biographers to write about him. But if you commit, you can find out a fair bit about him, and particularly descriptions from other people who knew him. And he was, a stern Mississippian, and he did not inspire great affection, particularly in his subordinates, who he ended up, who he treated with a very stern Mississippian authoritarian attitude. But Eisenhower could deal with that, in part because of his own father, and he ends up becoming probably the single greatest protege that Fox Connor ever has. And Eisenhower's mind is in a very dark place at the time and just completely opens up. And it's really Eisenhower's education, not just as a staff officer, but as a general. Fox Connor is the first person to really explain and show Eisenhower what it means to be a general. And he does it through history, he does it through novels, he does it through Clausewitz, he does it through Friedrich Nietzsche. And the Eisenhower who leaves the tutelage of Fox Connor is the Eisenhower. It's the first time you can see the Eisenhower that we come to understand as Ike in the modern sense.
What's fascinating about their relationship is that it mostly takes place in Panama,
Right?
where Fox Connor was sent in the mid-20s, as I recall, Michel, late 20s.
Yep. Early 20s, yeah, in the early 20s.
To be I guess, the military governor of Panama.
No, there's a story there, and I could never get to the bottom of it. Because Fox Connor is a very well-regarded teaching at the War College, probably the leading theorist of military art in the government, in the War Department in the 1920s. And he gets shipped off to this podunk post, like this podunk army post in the middle of nowhere, Panama. And is just put in charge of it. It's a post that's primarily staffed by Puerto Rican soldiers who don't even speak English. So the enlisted are non-English speakers who have just utter disdain for the gringo officers who are in charge of them, right? There's no discipline whatsoever in Panama generally, but especially on Fort Gaillard, which is the fort where he was assigned. So it's a really just random assignment. And I kind of think Connor was getting punished for something, and we just don't, and like history, we've just lost that to history. I tried really hard to figure out why on earth this guy got sent to this podunk fort down in Panama. Because Eisenhower very much got sent there as kind of a punishment, or at least as a purgatory. In the year before he's sent to Panama, Eisenhower is court-martialed. He's actually charged before court-martial. He gets wrapped up in a kind of bullshit, to be pardon my language, but a sort of a put-on embezzlement scheme where he came clean, right? It was an ambiguous army rule, as almost every army rule is, and but there was an inspector general who just wanted to make an example of Eisenhower because he was the highest ranking officer to get sort of wrapped up in this essentially overbilling scheme for housing. And so Eisenhower was looking at court-martial and prison, and ultimately is saved through the disposition of none other than his good buddy George S. Patton, because Patton and Fox Connor are very close, and Patton basically gets Connor to get Pershing, who is the Army Chief of Staff at the time, to send Eisenhower to Panama to be Connor's aide, to basically pull him out of the teeth of the Inspector General in Washington, who ends up having to kind of write just a nasty gram in Eisenhower's file, and sends him down to Panama to be Connor's assistant, his aide de camp, his XO.
So Fox Connor basically saves Eisenhower's career and then takes him under his wing for the time they're together in Panama and teaches him how, like you said, teaches him how to become a general.
Does.
And one of the keys I've always understood to Eisenhower's behavior as the supreme commander and how he got along with the Allies is that Fox Connor kind of taught him that because Fox Connor had that experience in World War One as one of the two or three key aides to Pershing, having to try to get along with the French and the British during World War One.
Yeah, absolutely. So Connor, I mean, is right in the thick of it during World War One and sees how not only the United States, he sees not only how futile World War One is in so many ways and studies it quite carefully and how are we going to overcome the obstacles of the Western Front, but he sees that the war ends up going on far longer because the inter-allied cooperation is basically impossible. The United States, as some of you may know, is actually sent to Europe and put under the command of General Foch in the French army. So we're actually fighting under the French army. The British are fighting on their own front, refusing basically to coordinate with the French, and all of the Allies are essentially trying to vie to get a bigger piece of the post-war pie when they eventually defeat Germany. And this, Connor can clearly see is preventing everyone from actually defeating Germany, right? So it's actually making the war more costly, and just creating more devastation, so that there's nothing left essentially at the end of World War One, to even declare victory over. And so one of the big challenges, and he's very clear about this in both in his own writings and to Eisenhower, was inter-allied cooperation. And Connor kind of thought it was impossible. He thought this was something that would almost never truly be possible between allies because of that desire to always fight for your national interest, right? Your own, not to mention just different cultural attitudes, the different command structures, different norms and expectations of the service. And so when Eisenhower becomes Supreme Allied Commander in 1942, the one thing he does, the only thing, frankly, Sir Alan Brooke, the British Chief of Staff, is ever willing to give Eisenhower credit for at all, is fostering inter-allied cooperation. And he does, particularly with the British, but even with other allies like the Italians and French to a lesser extent, but especially with the British to a degree that no one thought possible, right? Everyone is amazed. One of the quick anecdotes that I talk about in the book is he's actually visited by Keith Murdoch. And if the name Murdoch sounds familiar to you, it's because Keith Murdoch is the father of Rupert Murdoch. And Keith Murdoch was an Australian newspaperman, journalist, and mogul very much in his own right, and actually visits Eisenhower in the lead up to D-Day. Because Keith Murdoch is a loyal member of the British Empire and trying to see what's the state of the British Empire in 1944 and he is just blown away by Eisenhower's ability to have British and American personnel in his own planning staff sitting at the same desks, talking, cooperating, working on a common goal with a common language dividing them, as they would say. And Keith Murdoch, as an Australian, is just stunned by this and it loves Eisenhower as a consequence. And so Eisenhower's real achievement is so easy to underestimate. But not only maintaining, but creating inter-allied cooperation that was ultimately necessary for things like D-Day to ever be successful.
Right.
And he learned the need for that from Fox Connor.
So General Fox Connor, really, without Fox Connor, there may not have been Dwight Eisenhower as Supreme Allied Commander. One of the things Fox Connor does, last point, is he educates Ike so well that Eisenhower's next assignment is, I think, the Army War College.
Command and General Staff School. Yes, yeah.
Command and General Staff School. He goes there and graduates #1 in the class.
That's right. He does. And he's, yeah.
Because he just spent the last couple of years going through staff school with Fox Connor.
That's exactly right. And Connor says that Eisenhower is very apprehensive when he gets this opportunity. But, but by this point, Connor's like, no, you got to go to Command and General Staff School. That's the next step for an officer on the rise. And Eisenhower's like, I had okay grades at West Point, right? He was dead middle of his class, by no means a scholar. and had no command experience, right? He never fought in World War One, and his primary role in the army, certainly in the first decade of his career, was being a really good football coach.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And and so like Eisenhower is very nervous about his chances to succeed at Command and General Staff School. And Connor's like, I made you do everything they're going to make you do and more. You will find no sense of superiority, and it's true. Eisenhower, he works a lot harder than he ever lets on. He sort of develops this sort of devil may care attitude, the smile. Oh, I'm just hanging out, having fun, and then working and smoking cigarettes until 1 a.m. to learn absolutely every stitch of land that he needs to know for a battlefield exercise. But it's true. He learned to be a staff officer as much as he learned to be a general from Fox Connor. And so by the time he got the command and staff general staff school, he was first in his class, and it's stunned a lot of people actually.
Okay. So that's Fox Connor. We're going to go on to another person. I'm actually going to change the order of this. I'm doing this a command decision on the fly, just as I'm thinking about this chronologically. We'll talk about two more men who influenced Eisenhower, and then we'll take a break and take questions. Okay. So I'm going to jump to this slide because chronologically it kind of makes a little more sense than what I had, and that is one General Douglas MacArthur. And I just love this picture. As you can see, a very young Eisenhower, I'm guessing early 1930s, standing next to MacArthur, who was the chief of staff. You could just see the shoulder full of decorations. So explain the relationship between MacArthur and Eisenhower and how that influenced Ike.
So I don't quote me on this, but I have about 75% certainty that this photo is actually taken during the Bonus Army riots.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm 95% certain that's the case.
yeah, and not just because there's a cop standing right behind them, but yeah, but I think that photo is very revealing too. So Eisenhower would later say, he told MacArthur, don't go fussing around with these veterans, like it's going to be terrible, it's going to be a mess. Um, I kind of think that was less than candid with history. And I say that because I have, I went through Eisenhower's diaries at the time, which are sparse but not critical of MacArthur. And in fact, Eisenhower wrote the report for MacArthur, MacArthur's report defending his actions in the treatment of the Bonus Army. And of course, that was Eisenhower's job, but I don't think Eisenhower was off page, frankly, with MacArthur. Eisenhower in the early 1930s is an interesting character, especially because of who he becomes, in part because he has just come off this big success at the Command and General Staff School. He's beginning to work his way up. His ambition, his taste for ambition is really growing. He had a very cushy gig with General Pershing in Paris, helping Pershing write his memoirs, basically. And so Eisenhower is now finally stationed in Washington, D.C. in the War Department. And first with another general, General Moseley, who's close to MacArthur, and then gets himself to be one of, quote unquote, MacArthur's guys. And Eisenhower in the early 1930s is skeptical of democracy, as a lot of people were. It's easy to forget what the politics of the 1930s were like, even before the Depression fully set in. And Eisenhower is, seeing a country that is falling apart, particularly once the Depression does start, that is ungovernable, as the United States still is, arguably, and kind of always has been. And the comparisons that are, appealing to a lot of people, particularly in the United States, including many of his mentors, not the least being Douglas MacArthur and General Moseley, are people like Mussolini, right, who rise to prominence in the 1920s and 30s by governing their own ungovernable countries with an iron fist. And it seems like democracy is, nice in theory, but not good in practice if you want to get things done. Eisenhower is a skeptic of Franklin Roosevelt. He says he's a lightweight who just talks nice on the radio, is Eisenhower's candid opinion of Roosevelt in 1932, 1933. And so MacArthur is a natural person for Eisenhower to become smitten with in the early 1930s. MacArthur is MacArthur. I don't need to explain him to y'all. and goes quite happily with MacArthur to the Philippines. The goal being essentially in under the Roosevelt administration, Roosevelt promises the Philippines independence in 1945. Little did he know how that would happen. MacArthur is sent over to essentially stand up the Philippine army. MacArthur had spent almost his entire life and career in Asia, so he's an ideal person to do that. And Eisenhower is tickled by this opportunity to be literally the right hand of Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines. But over the course, like really 6 years together in the Philippines, over the course of that time, Eisenhower becomes both increasingly frustrated, but also like deeply disillusioned to the point of bitter hatred, frankly, by the time he leaves the Philippines with MacArthur, who himself, is a person of great talent and certainly great ego, but who also, has the sort of vaingloriousness of like a Kurtz figure in Apocalypse Now, if you know what I mean, right? He it goes to his head very easily, and there's frankly not that much really challenging for MacArthur to do at that point, right? MacArthur had already ascended to the very pinnacle of the army so quickly and so young that, setting up the Philippine army is just, he feels it's beneath him. He's essentially soaking the Filipinos for the modern equivalent of millions of dollars. He retires from the army in order to become a field marshal of the Filipino army, which is a position he creates for himself, indeed a uniform he creates for himself. And Eisenhower just becomes increasingly disgusted with, in a way, the inevitable trajectory of every strongman ruler who becomes just paranoid and lazy and just wrapped up in their own sort of crazy sort of delusions and ego. So that but by the time Eisenhower leaves the Philippines in 1939, he's not only like just exhausted by the experience, he thinks his career's over, and like is just desperate to get back home and away from MacArthur. And I think also, and he doesn't quite say this at the time, but you can begin to see also in his own writings about politics a growing appreciation for like small d democracy that comes to define his political ideology, right? He learns from MacArthur both the what the charismatic generalissimo, why that's appealing, like he was drawn to it, but he also learns its pitfalls and its dangers. And it's almost perfectly timed that the next person he meets is George Marshall.
And is it safe to say or accurate to say that over time he begins to see Douglas MacArthur's dark side, let's say?
Absolutely, yeah.
Unattractive.
Yeah. Unquestionably. And again, I'm actually much more generous to MacArthur than a lot of Eisenhower biographers probably are. Because I think MacArthur had just incredible talents in certain ways. Like, I don't think there's anyone, just to say, put a fine point on it, I don't think anyone could have governed post-war Japan as exceptionally well as Douglas MacArthur. That was perfect for him. Like, he was literally lab grown to do something like that.
That's well put.
But he was bad at a lot of other stuff. And in the Philippines, I think Eisenhower came to understand the limits of that kind of personality, right? That personality can be amazingly effective in certain contexts, but in others, in governance, when it's when duty has to take precedence over glory, that personality is just is going to be a catastrophe.
And then the perfect segue into the next man we're going to talk about that influenced him. And then we'll take a break and go for questions from the audience. But it's almost night and day in terms of these two mentors. The next important man in his life is General George Marshall.
Absolutely, it is night and day, heat and light. I mean, the general and the soldier. It's hard to think of two major figures in the army of this period more who are greater contrasts than Marshall and MacArthur. And I think Marshall is almost the perfect mentor. Eisenhower is just perfectly tuned to and ready for Marshall when he finally meets him. He's had this just evolution. He has this background. They know Fox. They both sort of are mentees of Fox Connor. And so when he goes and works under Marshall, it's just the culmination of so many things in Eisenhower's life, and it just rings perfectly. with where Eisenhower both is in his career and the kind of mentorship that he needs at that moment. Because of all of the wonderful things you can say, and some negative things you could say about George Marshall, the thing that stood out the most to Eisenhower, that stands out to anybody who looks back at Marshall today, is just an utter seriousness, right? A knowledge and a selfless commitment to duty above all else. And that's easy to say, but so many people, for so many reasons, let their egos get in the way. But with Marshall, there were so many opportunities. He had so many opportunities to put himself first and never did. And that just that not only appealed to Eisenhower's like to the bones, but showed Eisenhower that it wasn't that was not a mug's game either, right? That you could actually be the most powerful, influential general in the entire world if you firmly commit to duty and to something greater than yourself. And that relationship, that just practical willingness, commitment to duty, is something that's always in Eisenhower, but Marshall just brings it out of him, and it sort of forms, I think, the most important parts of Eisenhower's personality that he brings into leadership in the Second World War.
And leads to this just incredible relationship from the time Eisenhower goes to Europe for the next 3 years of the war.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There, there,
absolutely. As formative, I would say, at least as in some ways, as Fox Connor. Very different,
yeah.
but very much, yeah, very, very, very formative to Eisenhower.
One of my favorite Eisenhower stories is about Marshall. Um, so if you've read a lot about Marshall, there's a time during World War I when Marshall stands up to Pershing. Pershing was a bigger than life sort of man,
Yeah, he
right?
was a statue, a walking statue. Yeah.
And I can't remember the incident, but it takes place in the trenches, and Pershing stands up Marshall stands up to Pershing in a way that everybody around them says, "Oh my gosh, Pershing's gone." You know,
Yeah, yeah.
turns out just the opposite. Pershing's impressed with the way Marshall stands up to him. Well, there's a similar moment between Marshall and Eisenhower.
Mm,
Eisenhower is really not happy being head of the War Plans Division. It's another staff job. He wanted to, command troops, right?
yeah.
And I don't, you might remember this better than me, but there's a point where Marshall says something to Ike about, yeah, you're in a perfect job. You're going to be here a long time as my assistant. And it really rubs Ike the wrong way. And he gets up and walks out and he turns around and says, GD, I'll do whatever it takes to do, but I sure wish I could have command of troops. I don't remember if those were the right
Oh,
ones.
no, it's even better than that, actually. And I always wondered to what extent Marshall was testing Eisenhower in this moment, right? Is this a gauntlet that he's making Eisenhower run? And Marshall is just sort of talking to him casually about how he's going to tell Congress to not approve. And when Marshall tells Congress to do or not do something involving the war, that's what's going to happen. And he says he's going to tell Congress not to approve promotions for staff officers. And that there's all the promotions are going to be given to combat officers. And he says, look, like you're going to spend the rest of the war sitting at that desk, and I don't want to see you promoted 1 star. And Eisenhower is just like, he has a temper. As much as he has that big smile, he also has this hot temper. He's just stewing there. Like he's literally missed his own father's funeral to be at Marshall's side doing things like a week earlier. And he sort of gets up and he says, sir, I just don't care. Right? Like you can just hear his voice shaking as he's holding himself together. And he is fit to be tied. You know what I mean? And the only reason we know this for sure is his own journals. He actually ended up tearing up the page where he just like probably who knows what happened in there, but he just invade. But you still get flavors of it in some of the subsequent pages as he's just being
Yeah.
like for basically a couple of days. He even visits his son who sees him and he's kind of depressed. John Eisenhower sees him and Eisenhower's just depressed and he's just sort of like, I'm always just going to be some, army general at his desk and some desk general and sure enough, I think it's almost like the next day, Marshall promotes him. So, yeah.
So let's bring the audience into this and before we continue on with more of these people who influenced Ike. Sean, what kind of questions are there out there? Is anybody that has their hand up? I see one person with a hand up.
Justin Miller, go ahead. Ask you to unmute, Justin.
In 1941, wasn't Eisenhower a colonel before as he moved up early in 41? And something about the Park Service, he was promoted to temporary brigadier. I remember reading that.
So he gets his promotion to 1 star when he moves to head what comes to be reorganized and called the War Plans Division. And so that is January, February of 42. So he goes, he's a colonel. He gets promoted to colonel, I want to say in 40, right around the time of these Louisiana maneuvers, which is the sort of biggest military exercise the United States engages in prior to the Second World War. And goes to Washington, I want to say still as an 06, as a colonel, and then gets his star when he's put in charge of the War Plans Division after G. Giroux is pushed out.
Yeah, prior to his, and he doesn't go to the Pentagon. Well, it wasn't the Pentagon then. It doesn't go to the War Department with Marshall until after Pearl Harbor, right?
That's right.
But prior to that, between leaving the Philippines, he's chief of staff of one of the I'm sorry, of what?
When Ninth Army was chief of staff.
Yeah, and he's in those Louisiana maneuvers. He's a colonel, et cetera, et cetera. So he's a little closer to what he would have preferred, being with troops. And his call to D.C. to work for Marshall is, he's rather ambiguous about it, I think, because here he is behind a desk.
Yeah. Yeah, he's basically ordered. But his predecessor in the job actually dies in just a freak plane accident. And he has several old friends who are working in Marshall's office, including G. Giroux. And Marshall is needs someone quick, and they all kind of say, who'd be good? Ike Eisenhower. And so he gets the call. Beal Smith actually gives him the call. I think that might be the first time they talk to each other, and basically orders him to report to Washington immediately. And this is in the middle of December of 41.
I see Greg Yost with his hand up. Greg?
Yes, thank you so much for this presentation. I am also a huge Eisenhower fan and extensively studied him and have the greatest respect for him. I agree with your assessment of him being the most significant U.S. political figure of the second half of the 20th century, among other things. While we're on Marshall, though, I hope I'm not jumping too far ahead. I don't know how far you want to go, if you want to stop at World War II or something. But there was something that happened between Eisenhower and Marshall in the fall of 1952. And I hope this is not getting too far ahead, and I'll try to explain it to the audience here. First of all, Marshall had gone to China after World War II to try to negotiate a settlement between the nationalists and the communists. It didn't work out. Eisenhower had been critical of that. He didn't think Marshall had done a very good job there, for what it's worth. In the fall campaign of 1952, when Eisenhower is running for president, it appears to be a close race. It ends up to be a blowout. He blows Stevenson out of the water. But early on, it looked like it was going to be a 50-50 race. And Joseph McCarthy was leading his McCarthy campaign against, the McCarthyism, as we know. McCarthy had been very critical of Marshall in China, said he sold out China to the communists, yada, yada, yada. There was a speech that Eisenhower was giving in Wisconsin, which then as now was a swing state. And the Eisenhower people released a copy of the speech to the news media before the speech. In the copy of the speech, there was a criticism or there was praise of George Marshall with his great patriotism and how much he had done. And he was basically slapping Joe McCarthy in the face in the printed copy of the speech. But Eisenhower didn't give that in the real speech that he gave at this Republican rally running for president. So the headlines became "The Tribute Not Given to Marshall" in front of Joseph McCarthy and the Republicans in Wisconsin. Did they ever make up? Did Eisenhower and Marshall ever make up before Marshall's passing in 59, or did they always have that against each other for the last 7 years of Marshall's life?
Yeah, so it depends on who you ask. I think so. Marshall is Marshall. He's very stoic and kind of to the extent he could, I think, let it go. Um, and Eisenhower was always, I think, I know, I mean, he was embarrassed and ashamed of himself for having done that, and so I think made an extra effort to kind of kiss up to Marshall, which doesn't actually work with Marshall that well. So yeah, I mean, Marshall doesn't do he doesn't sort of use Marshall a lot during his own presidency. Marshall's also pretty old by that point too. But the one person though who I know never forgives, and I don't think ever speaks to Eisenhower again, is Marshall's wife. For that, and like is refuses to entertain him, refuses to talk to, like literally ice cold. So Marshall's like very difficult figure. He's a very stoic figure. That's Marshall, right? That's the essence of Marshall. Whether or not his personal feelings aligned more with his wife's, or whether or not he had a sort of more pragmatic attitude about it, only I think Marshall probably really knows. But I do know that his wife never forgives Eisenhower ever, which is interesting.
Thank you, Greg. That is a little outside of what we were planning on for tonight because we were focused on D-Day and his run up to becoming Supreme Commander. But that's fine. Marshall and well, I am planning sometime probably in the fall, maybe the winter, a program on Marshall and a program on another name that is long forgotten, and that's Henry Stimson, the
Mm.
Secretary of War during World War II, who not too many people can know. Sean, other questions in the chat or from the audience we should address?
How did he get the name Ike?
Oh, so this I spent excessive amounts of time trying to figure this exact question out because Ike is not a natural nickname for Dwight. People said it was short for Eisenhower, which makes no sense because he grew up in a town with like 100 Eisenhowers, and so it wasn't a name that you would be unfamiliar with. Also, Eisenhower is not that hard to say. Um, they've given all sorts of semi-honest or sort of like answers to this at different times, like particularly from when he was running for office. The best answer I can give you, it comes down to two things that happened. One is that he had an older brother, Edgar, who was very close in age to him. They were almost like twins. They were actually in the same year at high school eventually because Edgar was held back. Um, but they were notorious bruisers, right? They would always be fighting in public, and they got the nicknames Big Ike and Little Ike, which is not a cultural reference that means anything to us now. But that cultural type of Big Ike and Little Ike is actually a stock character of a kind from turn of the 20th century minstrel shows. And I can't repeat in polite company like a lot of the lyrics to that, but like the analogy I would use to some extent would be today, like calling, like having a friend and calling him, like saying, "Hey, what's up, thug?" Right? And calling him a thug, right? It's sort of a slightly political, it's even at the time, it was a sort of slightly politically incorrect kind of way of joking around and giving someone a nickname. So Edgar and Eisenhower were known as Big Ike and Little Ike in Abilene, just as a kind of a nickname, or people called them that because it was sort of a funny way of referring to these two guys just beating up on each other. Um, and it has slightly racially insensitive quality to it, I think we can say. And when Eisenhower though goes to Abilene, or sorry, excuse me, when Eisenhower goes to West Point, that's the first time that's the first time he starts going by Ike as a nickname. Ike itself as a nickname. And we know this in part because anyone who knew him beforehand, even through high school, calls him Dwight till the day's dead. And people even kind of make fun of him, like from Abilene, make fun of him for going by a new nickname after he left Abilene. So it happens in West Point. It happens very early. Everyone at West Point knows him by the name of Ike. And I think part of that is the other sort of relevance or resonance that the name Ike would have had at the turn of the 20th century is in Westerns. It's also a name you see a lot in Westerns. And Eisenhower, to the day he died, read Westerns. He equivalent binge watched Westerns, um, and Western novels, Western magazines. That was true as a kid, and it was certainly all true through his life. And why I think that resonated with him particularly, why Ike felt like a very natural or desirable nickname for Eisenhower to have when he moved to West Point was, he goes to West Point as I mentioned before, like this dirt poor kid from the middle of nowhere, from Kansas, And he's there with, generals' sons and other people from all around the world who are just a lot more sophisticated than him. And he talks a little bit about this actually in that book I mentioned earlier, at ease. Like he gets there and he is fish out of water. Like his clothes don't fit right, and he can't dance. Like he has no rhythm, so he can't march in time, and so it's very awkward. He's fundamentally just a really awkward, kind of skinny guy, skinny, gangly, awkward guy from Kansas. Um, but he's not just from Kansas, he's from Abilene, Kansas. And Abilene is this sort of it's a lot like Tombstone, Arizona in the period, right? It's utterly it's permanently associated with the Old West because Abilene had been sort of one of the big cowboy towns in the 1880s. And Eisenhower actually knew some of the old cowboys who sort of stayed around Abilene and taught him how to play poker and stuff like that. And so it's in West Point that Eisenhower actually takes on this whole new persona, this cowboy persona, where he starts like swaggering around. He starts drawling a little more than he otherwise would have. He develops this he starts like smoking a lot and playing poker and doing all of these things to sort of play up this devil may care cowboy image. And Ike is actually a stock is like a stock character like that from Western novels. So if you look in old Western novels, and I read a bunch of these to try and get to the bottom of all this, like the Ike character is always sort of a big guy who has kind of a weird past. He talks rough, but he's the guy you can always trust to be good in a fight and who will always do the right thing in the end, right? He's that sort of figure from the Western. And Eisenhower sort of adopts this, and you can get this from some of his classmates at West Point. Sort of adopts this kind of swaggering cowboy persona and starts telling people that's his name Dyke, right? He tells people to start calling him Mike. And so that's the origin. That's basically where. So it's at West Point, and it's when he's sort of acting like a cowboy that he takes on the name Ike.
Michel, that's just a fantastic explanation of that one. As many biographies I've read on Ike, I've never heard, and I appreciate that deeply. That's all new to me. So. Sean, should we take a station break and talk about our upcoming programs for a couple of minutes?
Absolutely. As I mentioned earlier in the program, we have a very busy week coming up next week. I'll get to that in just a sec. We want to for life for supporting us at the Veterans Breakfast Club. They have programs designed by veterans that can save you money. You can check them out at upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. We have a free quarterly magazine. This is the current magazine, the spring issue, commemorating the fall of Saigon and the fall of Kabul. Our next issue will be all about VJ Day. We will have historical and educational articles talking about that anniversary, as well as stories from veterans. Brad mentioned in the comments earlier that I wonder how many World War II veterans are still alive. Just quick Google searched it. It said, estimated about 66,000. The veterans that are in our next summer issue have all passed, but we were able to capture their thoughts about VJ Day. So if you don't get the magazine, it's just because we don't have your address. Please send that to us. You could send it to me, Sean, SHAUN, at veteransbreakfastclub.org, and we'll make sure that you get put on our mailing list for the free quarterly magazine. Coming up next week, Monday night, Veterans Open Conversation. If you haven't joined us for one of these, they're wonderful. Todd or I will be hosting, and really we just we open up the room. Instead of having like a special guest like Michel tonight, we just say, hey, everybody bring your topics. If you want to bring a story or something that you want to talk about in the veteran space, we'd love to hear from you. So join us Monday night, 7 p.m., same Zoom channel for the open conversation. Then on I think it's Tuesday morning, or no, Tuesday evening. Sorry, Tuesday evening. We're used to doing in-person breakfast. This is our only time that we do smash burgers and have the younger crowd join us at the Grist House. So join us Tuesday evening, 5 p.m. for our regular VBC programming. We get to go out, have some drinks, have some smash burgers, have some veteran stories. It's a great time. That's a Wednesday morning. We're back in Swickley, or at Christchurch or Grove Farm. Been there for many years. A great space, a great crowd. Great breakfast. Please join us Wednesday morning. If you haven't, just RSVP. Go ahead and send us an email. We'll get you on the list. Thursday, we are going to commemorate the life of Julia Parsons. Julia passed away earlier this year in April, 104 years old. Navy wave, helped to decode Enigma. Brilliant. She joined us for the last 14 years here at VBC, even online, and was with it until the end. She was had an amazing life. Her family, if you can imagine, she's 104. A lot of her family, her kids are in their 80s. So they didn't have anything, they weren't able to get anything together for her funeral. So we're going to commemorate her life and honor her at the Heinz History Center on Women's Veterans Day. That's June 12th, 10 a.m. Light refreshments, but it's a great time to get together and just remember Julia. We've done that here on our online programs. We'd love for you all of it to join us at the Heinz History Center to remember Julia and the amazing life that she had. We will also be having a Women Veterans Day conversation on Thursday evening. So 7 p.m. back here on Zoom. Then Saturday morning we'll be at in Butler at the VA there, not the VA, I'm sorry, forgetting when the name of the place that we're going in it's on our website. Check under events, in-person breakfast. Saturday morning in Butler. We'll be there for another breakfast. And last but not least, Saturday evening, because it's Flag Day and it's the Army birthday, we're going to pair with the Washington Wild Things and have a VBC day there at the park for their game. A great time. If you're Army, if you're joining us and you have never thrown out the first pitch at a game, please let me know. We would love for you to get up there and throw out the first pitch for VBC and to commemorate the Army birthday and Flag Day. Brad, maybe you could ride your bike up here by that point. We'd love to see you at the game. Be nice to have you here in Pittsburgh. But great programs all next week, all educational. Please join us for each and every one if you can.
I'm exhausted just thinking about all that. An awful lot of activity, Sean, in the next couple of weeks. I'd like to promote my own shows here. I'm taking off next Thursday for that other program, but on Thursday, June 19th, we're going to have another author, and that's Joe Balkowski, who's one of the leading authors on D-Day and the Normandy invasion. He's the historian for the 29th Division, one of the divisions that landed at Omaha Beach. And we're going to focus not on D-Day, but on the Battle of Normandy after D-Day, which doesn't get as much attention. D-Day is the iconic day, which we all know and focus on. This is going to be on what happens after D-Day. So we're kind of taking it from Supreme Commander down to a division, the famous 29th Division. And then on June 26th, we're going to feature the daughters of two D-Day veterans, who I don't know, Susan Friedenberg. Yeah, Susan, I see you on. I'll just get you to unmute just for a second. Susan, could you unmute?
Yeah, thank you. I'm on my PC is not working. I'm on my cell phone. I can't see anybody. My cat, I apologize for my cat getting in the mix constantly. She has to be near me all the time. My daddy was in the fourth wave at Omaha Beach. He was a medic, and he left the war with 2 Purple Hearts, 2 Silver Stars, 2 bronze medals, honored by the French government, honored at the D-Day. I'm a little, this whole D-Day thing has me so freaked out. I get so emotional when I see any visuals of what daddy went through. It's just incomprehensible that my father lived through 4.5 years of that. And it just blows my mind. And so anyway, I'm just thrilled that you're going to feature my beloved father. And I just want to say that tomorrow on D-Day in Atlantic City, where we are from, there's a 3,500-pound monument. I'm hoping, Glenn, that you'll show it when we do our thing. Sure. But there's a 3,500-pound monument of my beloved daddy on his knees, cradling a wounded soldier. Daddy was a medic with a gun. I love to say that. Bernie always had his gun. And anyway, if anybody wants to show up tomorrow at 2:00 at Albany Avenue and across from Stockton University, CBS News will be there. And we're going to honor all World War II veterans that fought on D-Day, and in particular, the medics in both campaigns. And God bless you for what you guys do. God bless you.
Thank you, Susan. We're really looking forward to that program in a couple of weeks' time. The other daughter is the daughter of another well-known World War II D-Day veteran, and that's Dutch Schultz. I don't know if you recognize that name. Dutch Schultz was 82nd Airborne. If you're a fan of The Longest Day, both the book and the movie, he's featured in, not featured, there's many scenes of Dutch Schultz, right? Dutch Schultz goes on to fight with the 82nd Airborne throughout the rest of the campaign in Northwest Europe. His daughter is born after the war. Dutch Schultz suffered from what we now know as PTSD in a very significant way. He was this hero featured in that movie, but also featured in several other post-war books. Yet he had these extreme problems. His daughter grows up with him in that, to the point where his daughter becomes a PhD in psychology in an attempt to understand it. And she's written a couple of excellent books about her father and the life that she led and her family led post-war, growing up in the 50s and 60s under those conditions. So we're really looking forward to that program. So we're kind of bringing it from Supreme Commander to Division, now to the two guys, examples of two men who were in the foxholes, if you will.
Glenn, may I say one more thing?
Sure.
Thank you. I just want to say that my father wrote a book, which I'll be promoting when we do our video. Daddy wrote a book, and it was to purge himself. The shrinks from the Wilmington hospital said he needed to do that because my brother took him to see Saving Private Ryan. He had never spoken a word about the war until that movie came out, and Greg had to take him out of the theater. He flipped out in the movie. He went nuts. And
I was aware of that, Susan, from our previous discussions, and it's actually why I paired you with Carol. Her name is Carol Vento, her married name, because your two fathers had very similar issues, if you will, as a result of the extreme experience they went through.
And Daddy, his whole life, this is the honest to God truth, his whole life, he grieved the men that he didn't save, the men that died in his arms.
Yeah.
It made him crazy. I was so blessed. I had the greatest daddy on earth. God bless everybody who served in World War II, and God bless the medics. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Okay. We're going to come back to Michel. Michel, as often happens, we have prepared 6 or 7 of these examples of the people who influenced Eisenhower. And given the time frame, we're probably not going to get to every single one of them.
That's okay. Yeah, sorry, I'm a law professor. I can talk forever. That's one of my great flaws.
That's true of many of us,
Yeah.
Michel. So no apologies needed. And the subject is just so fascinating. I could, as you and I did when we talked to each other introductory, we could do this for hours and hours. The next person we wanted to, are you seeing this? Did I do this correctly?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody seen Franklin Roosevelt and Eisenhower up here?
Yes.
So Franklin Roosevelt is a huge influence. And this gets in now to the story, Michel, as to how Ike goes from, running the North African campaign, let's just say colloquially, to getting the assignment to be the Supreme Commander for the invasion of Normandy. This picture is taken in 1943, just before
43, yeah, December 43.
Just before the Tehran conference, when
this is actually right after. This is taken in Sicily. Yeah.
Okay. So explain for us how you think Franklin Roosevelt influenced. Obviously, he plays a big role because eventually Franklin Roosevelt says, yes, Ike's the guy to be the Supreme Commander, right? And there's a whole story in that we got to tell. But even other than that, there's a significant influence by Franklin Roosevelt on Eisenhower as a man.
Oh yeah, for sure. And it comes, I mean, at a really interesting time in Eisenhower's life. And one of the other things, in addition to figuring out why he was named Ike, that I spent an exorbitant amount of time on, certainly relative to what my editor thought I should be writing about, was this decision of like why Eisenhower in the first place. And I tell that story in a lot of detail, and so I won't belabor it. But it's this question of like, how did Roosevelt choose Eisenhower? Like, why was that choice made as opposed to Marshall, for example, which was what everyone, including Eisenhower, thought Roosevelt was going to do after the Cairo and Tehran conferences, when the leader for D-Day had to be picked. And what made it really interesting or puzzling to me for amongst many other reasons, is Eisenhower and Roosevelt actually don't know each other all that well in November of 1943. And that matters a lot because Roosevelt is one of those, he's a quintessential politician, right? Everything is personal. He picks people he likes and trusts based on meeting with them, pressing the flesh. Like he's not he's not the kind of person to run people through an algorithm to figure out who he wants doing a job. He thinks about, who is this man? Can I trust them? Do they have the skills and the judgment to do what I want them to do? And so prior to 1940, November of 1943, they'd only met on, best I can tell, 3 different occasions. Eisenhower does not impress Roosevelt at any of those, quite the contrary. And so they have this meeting in November of 1943 as Roosevelt is on his way to do this big summit with Churchill and Stalin in Tehran. And when Eisenhower is still a pretty marginal figure in the overall sort of command level of the war, Eisenhower is not invited to any of these fancy conferences. And Roosevelt ends up having to essentially have a layover in Algeria, where Eisenhower's headquarters, one of his headquarters, and then in Tunisia, where not only the first real Allied victories in the North Africa campaign are won, but also, where the ancient battlefields of Carthage are. And so Eisenhower takes this opportunity to get to know Roosevelt over the course of a couple of days, to include going on a battlefield tour all around Carthage in northern Tunisia, where Eisenhower not only shows Roosevelt the Tunisian battlefields that had been captured, a year earlier, but the Carthaginian ones. And it's a great bit of luck, actually, for Eisenhower. But I mentioned earlier that Eisenhower had, wanted, probably as almost a form of rebellion against his parents, wanted to be a general from the time he was a boy. And a major reason for that was one of Eisenhower's first mentors, someone who's largely forgotten to history entirely, is a guy named Joe Howe, who published the local Democratic newspaper in Abilene. And Eisenhower would basically go to Joe Howe's newspaper office and hang out with friends after school. And Joe Howe would just get books in from all over the country, and was one of the first people, not unlike Fox Connor, to just kind of hand Eisenhower a book. And the first book Joe Howe gave Eisenhower, the first one Eisenhower remembers, was The Life of Hannibal. And Eisenhower brings this home as a young man, probably, we don't know exact dates, but it's probably about 12 years old, 12 to 14 years old. Goes home, is read The Life of Hannibal, and his deeply religious pacifist mother confiscates this book. Because not only is it all about war and conquest, which the Bible students are extremely opposed to, it's about a pagan on top of that, right? It's about Hannibal. And so Eisenhower, it gets his Life of Hannibal taken away. It's put into his mother's closet, and Eisenhower would sneak in to his mother's closet when she was out in the garden, like he was like pulling out a Playboy, to basically read The Life of Hannibal, because it was this like forbidden knowledge that he just couldn't resist. And so when Roosevelt asks Eisenhower to take him on a tour of the Carthaginian battlefields, like, this is stuff Eisenhower has known for, at this point, 40 years, right? This is down to his bones. He knows the Carthaginian battlefields and what Hannibal was doing and where the elephants probably were used. And this just lights Roosevelt up, because, Roosevelt himself is a bit of an amateur historian, and, he's properly and traditionally educated as well. So the fact that this kind of rube from Kansas, who everyone just thinks is a nice guy, can discourse on Hannibal and the where the Battle of Zama was and how that would have went, I think is the first inkling, and it is the only real opportunity, only first opportunity that Eisenhower has to be seen as Roosevelt, as someone more who is deeper than he appears. And the second thing that's going on throughout all of that is that Eisenhower is only known, one of the only personal things that that Roosevelt thinks he knows about Eisenhower, is that Eisenhower is supposedly having an affair with his Irish driver, a woman by the name of Kay Summersby. And if you show that film again, which I found in an archive, and just like the top of my head blew off when I saw it, is from almost the moment Roosevelt gets into first Algeria and then Tunisia, where Eisenhower greets him, he starts hazing Eisenhower about Kay Summersby. Like almost the first words out of his mouth to his general are, "How's that Irish girl?" And basically, over the course of this weekend, Roosevelt keeps not only demanding that Eisenhower talk about Kay Summersby, he starts inviting Kay Summersby to their, dinners and excursions. He actually insists on Kay Summersby sitting near him at dinner so that he can pepper Kay with questions, with Eisenhower just sitting right there. And I don't know if you got to see it in that video of Roosevelt and Eisenhower just having a little picnic in the back of their car. If you look to the front seat of that car, the only other person in the car with them is, if you can see it, and this is what blew the top of my head off when I finally got to watch this film.
Sorry.
Was yeah, let me see.
I got it here in just a second.
Yeah, well, it's probably one frame, but there it is. Yeah. If you look, who's the only other person in the car with them? It's Kay Summersby. And that was very much at Roosevelt's insistence that she drive them around on this tour of the battlefields. And so again, like as a historian, you can only go with what's documented, but Roosevelt leaves convinced that they're having a romantic relationship. And he certainly didn't think the worst of Eisenhower for it. Like quite the contrary. When Eisenhower visits him in the White House only a few months later, not only does Roosevelt bring up Kay Summersby again, he actually hands Eisenhower an autographed picture to give to Kay, right? An autographed picture of the president. And so what do these two things tell us? Well, for Roosevelt, someone who is an incredibly intuitive politician, incredibly personality driven, here's this guy who I think this guy in Eisenhower who had never made an impression on Roosevelt at all prior to this time. And we know that because Eisenhower does not appear in any of Roosevelt's personal correspondence, who not only has this wildly interesting, deep knowledge of ancient history that seems surprising for some random soldier, but smiles a lot and can keep his cool when he's being hazed by the president of the United States about his mistress, or his believed mistress. And I think in that moment, Roosevelt understood that Eisenhower, A, was much more interesting than he ever let on, and B, had the precise skill set that would be needed to hold the Anglo-American alliance together, not only through D-Day, but through the rest of the war, because that was a big question. We forget it now, but that was a real big question in November of 1943. And it's in that moment, in that relationship, that I think in some ways Roosevelt sees Eisenhower, maybe even before Eisenhower does, but he sees the politician. And I mean that in a positive way, but he sees the political instincts, the guy who can get things done and keep everybody happy in a way that certainly Roosevelt had never seen before, and that, Eisenhower and sort of brings out of Eisenhower in a way that I don't think even Eisenhower fully understood at the time.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, which we really don't have the time to go into because there's one other person I want to bring into this, one other influencer, if you will. But the story of Marshall and Eisenhower and how it was communicated to Eisenhower that he was the man.
Yeah, by the guy who probably wanted the job. We don't know that, but yeah, for the guy who certainly deserved it.
And another great story about Marshall himself as a man who
absolutely
basically Roosevelt gave him the chance to say, yeah, I'll take the job, but he would not say the words.
Yeah.
So given the time frame here, there's one more person I want to bring into this, and it'll be the last one we get to mention before we bring the audience back in for some ending questions. And that's another little known figure, forgotten to history, his brother, Milton Eisenhower, who you devote a chapter to in the book. Tell us about Milton and how he interacted with his brother.
Yeah, Milton, is forgotten now, but anyone who was sort of news aware and into politics in the 50s and even 60s, and certainly before that, Milton would be almost like a household name, the way Bob Gates or Leon Panetta, right? These sort of political figures who are sort of in the government, but never politicians themselves. And Milton was actually much more famous than Eisenhower for a significant period of time. He comes to Washington in the 1920s as something of a wonderkind in the new art of what at the time was not pejoratively called propaganda. And that sounds like really weird. Like, why would that be an interesting skill to have? Well, it was very new in the time, right? This is a period where newspapers are yielding to radio in a big way, and mass communication is becoming a big part of how politics is done. And Milton, a lot like the kind of gurus now who would know all about AI and tell people, okay, this is how you're going to use AI to make $1 million in your business or something like that. Milton was one of the early people to really get modern public relations in a big way, in a political way, and so becomes this permanent Washington figure in Republican and Democratic administrations alike, and has a very interesting political career in his own right that I will not go into because it's too interesting. We'll be here till 10 o'clock at night. But Milton, not unlike Roosevelt in some ways, actually sees Eisenhower's political potential, I think, far earlier than Eisenhower ever does. And Milton has the combination of wherewithal and connections to know how to put it to good use. And that's it's very easy to overlook people like Milton Eisenhower because they're very, their whole job is to sort of be in the side, be in the shadows. But in turning Eisenhower, the very successful popular general, into a major political figure, and to have a particular kind of story to tell, because that's Milton Eisenhower, and that's important, especially important in 1945 when Eisenhower's political career really begins, because not only is the United States totally different in 1945 than it was in 1940, and there's just almost no way to overstate how much of a change those 4 years were in terms of the United States' sense of itself, its role in the world, all that kind of stuff. The world was completely different, right? We went from a world of empires predominated by the British Empire to one divided really between the Soviet Union and the United States as the two world superpowers, right? A totally different world in 1945 and in 1940. And there are a lot of things going on, but one of the things Milton, I think, really understands is that we are entering really a new era of, again, small d democracy. And that political power is going to just be different from here on out, particularly in America. And that if we want to have a kind of democratic revival, and if we want to put all of that suffering and loss and investment that the war demanded to good use, that we can pull out of the American story sort of our the greatest threads, the sweetest sounds, and sell those back. And I mean that slightly cynically, but not really. I think it's to a very good end of a new kind of politics, a new kind of sense of America and the American story that Dwight Eisenhower, because of his rags to riches life story, because of his service in the war, and because of his sort of homespun big smile, right? You can imagine him with a Coca-Cola in his hand just as much as you can imagine anything else. Is almost the perfect embodiment of this potential that America had, that Eisenhower's presidency was largely dedicated to trying to cultivate, and really ends up lasting for decades as the sort of the political type, the political ground on which American politics is fought.
One of the interesting last points about Milton is how Milton in 1944, right, before D-Day, I believe, was trying to influence Eisenhower to be more political, and was having a biography written about him at that time.
Several, actually, yeah.
And Eisenhower fights him off at that time, saying it's just not appropriate at this moment.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, no, so Milton is sort of doing all of these sort of shenanigans basically to get biographies that don't seem like they're being written by Milton Eisenhower at the behest of Milton Eisenhower, written about Eisenhower. So there's one by a guy named Alden Hatch, which is sort of a book primarily for young people, sort of telling the Eisenhower story as like as what we'd now call like a Horatio Alger story. And then another one where Milton actually puts his personal speechwriter up to it and gets him a really good book contract to write a book that's called Soldier of Democracy, which is a more serious biography of Eisenhower. but that really does again present Eisenhower as the modern George Washington, right? That's its goal. And he even comes to England, and Eisenhower sort of begrudgingly sits down with the guy and completely charms him, right? Like I ended up investigating the papers of this biographer just as much as almost anybody else, just because like here's some guy who's going to see Eisenhower right at this time. Like what is he seeing? Who's he interviewing? That kind of stuff. And yeah, no, Milton is very, very smart, right? He knows what he's doing, and he's applying the same sort of dark arts of public relations that he applied to, helping the agriculture department sell the New Deal to his brother, because he sees his brother's potential. And again, it's not there's a cynical element to it, but it's not entirely cynical, right? Milton Eisenhower is a deep thinker about America's potential, and the potential of a government that is able to enhance people's liberty fundamentally, to give them the opportunity to have the same kind of, life trajectory that people like Eisenhower had, and that the government is able to do that. And like they're ultimately very conservative, Midwesterners,
Oh, yeah.
but it's about translating the kind of idea of giving people opportunity into a broader American story that can allow people to, do their own thing and flourish and live the good life without having to be told by the government, what to do.
The other way I've always thought about Eisenhower's life, it's very Lincoln-esque, born in a log cabin,
Yeah.
grows up on the frontier, becomes president of the United States. I mean, there's some parallels there that another program we could talk about.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And Milton did not lose sight of those parallels, right? He very much understood that his brother could tell a very American story.
Yeah.
And it was like, if I could sort of just, I know we're running into time, but if there's like one thing about Eisenhower that's cliche, but I think genuinely true and worth admiring a little bit, is it is a really just American story. He's an incredibly American figure, as much as, Louis Armstrong in jazz, or any other, or Mark Twain, right? There are certain people who just embody something that really could only ever happen in America in the best possible way. And that's not just sort of, again, the propaganda Milton Eisenhower would tell you. That's how the British viewed Eisenhower and people all around the world, because it's easy to forget how different the world of the early 1940s was from the world of the end of the 1940s. The world of the early 1940s looked the same basically as the world from 100 years ago, before that. And so Eisenhower comes to Europe as this American general who's like smiling and charming and working together for a common cause. And he's like, comes from nowhere. He's not anybody's son, right? He's not stiff. He's not imperious. Like he's I like Ike. It's very likable, and it's this almost fairy tale. If you're living in a place like the British Empire, where, your ability to rise to the top of the hierarchy depends entirely on, who your father was and who his father was, and that kind of thing.
So we've reached more or less the bewitching hour, but I don't want to stop here without offering the chance for the audience to ask any questions of Michel. We obviously have quite the knowledgeable expert on Eisenhower, and let's not lose the opportunity to ask him anything on your mind about Eisenhower.
I think the best person to talk to you right now would be Scott Masters, who sent me a chat, and Russell Freeberg. Scott, you want to take it?
Yeah, absolutely. Michel, this has been a fantastic show. Really enjoyed it, and I ordered your book on Amazon tonight.
I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad to hear it.
I'm kind of curious about, what you found out about common soldiers' attitudes towards Ike. And I thought you should know that there's a 102-year-old veteran named Russell Freeberg in the room. And I thought it would be interesting to hear your take on that as well as Russell's.
Yeah, I'd be more interested in his take than mine. Eisenhower was actually quite popular, and he made a point of it. And I'll just mention two things about that, because I know we're running late. One is he's one of these people who really picks up on the good things in other people and copies them. And one of the things that always impressed him about Bernard Montgomery, who, most biographers, certainly of Eisenhower, are quite critical of, was Monty's just like the utter affection he had both for his men and from his men. And Eisenhower kind of envied that actually a little bit. And so sort of stole some of Monty's, quote, tricks of the trade, because Monty would just be very informal in some ways with his men. Like after he would do like a speech, he'd just come down and then mingle. And Eisenhower emulates that. He picks up on the same thing. And so when he does these reviews, he tries to make them informal, and then really does a lot like what he did, famously did in the night before D-Day. Just walks around and shakes people's hands, asks them where they're from, and tries to connect with them on a human level. And that won him a lot of affection from his men. And the only other thing I'll say about that too, is that's in contrast to a lot of his colleagues in the American Army, most notably Patton. Like there are a lot of like Patton's memory has been saved by a lot of different things, to include Hollywood and his premature death. But he had a real trouble with subordinates who had a lot of hostility to Patton, even if they don't quite say that now in retrospect. Like the contemporary accounts of Patton's subordinates are pretty stark. And Eisenhower is really distinguished from that.
So Russell Freeberg is in the room. Russell, I wish I had noticed you in the room earlier. I'd have called on you much earlier. Michel, Russell is a World War II veteran and quite an author himself and well-known journalist post-war. We've had Russell on a few times. Scott Masters introduced him to us. Russell fought through the last 6 months of the war in Northwest Europe with the Ninth Army. Russell, thanks for being here.
Well, I'm always interested in the programs of the Veterans Breakfast Club. And of course, I did know Eisenhower personally, not close to him, but as a journalist. And I first covered him in Chicago in 1952 when he was fighting for the nomination to run as for president at the Republican National Convention was in Chicago that year. And then I went to Washington in late 1959. So I covered him occasionally. I was not the regular White House correspondent or the Tribune that time, but I was in the White House off and on and covered him. And I went with him down to Huntsville one day, and where he was introduced to the Saturn rocket, and covered him that day. And I was in and out of the White House. He was very friendly with reporters, very, very common among us, and so on. And I was at Gettysburg twice, and I've told that story, one of the stories. I was at Gettysburg when he entertained the Republican National Committee. Another time when he read a statement on the U.S. giving up the Panama Canal Zone. I probably am one of the very few people alive that was around him personally. I liked him.
To have you on, Russell. Let me ask one question and then maybe another. And if we go long tonight, I hope everybody forgives us, because this is a prize having Russell with us and someone who knew or met Eisenhower. First, as a 19, 20-year-old soldier towards the end of the war, what was your impression of Eisenhower as the Supreme Commander? What did the guys say about Ike? Because I know you were in a half track for most of that time. When you're hanging out in a half track talking about that Supreme Commander, what did you have to say?
Well, I think everyone respected him and liked him, and we're very happy that he was our Supreme Commander.
Yeah.
Eisenhower was very down to earth to me, as a man, was very down to earth. And I think he could get along with anyone at any time. He just had that kind of personality.
Michel, would you like to ask Russell a question?
I'd like to ask you a lot of questions, but I know we're running late. Yeah, so did you, as a reporter, like up close with him, did you ever get a sense, like how good was he at sort of the public presentation? Because I read one of the more interesting oral histories that I got to read was by he was part of he was the White House correspondent, I think, for the AP through the Eisenhower administration, and had been there for some time.
Doug Cornell.
No, no, that's not it. Sorry, I'm totally forgetting his name. But it was a really interesting it was a really interesting oral history. It was done about, around the time of Eisenhower's death. And it was he just had this um kind of like he found Eisenhower as to just be personally fascinating as a person because he had this because he sort of wore this sort of like I'm just a simple country boy suit all the time. But then if he had to get serious, like he could turn on a dime and be very serious, and then all of a sudden, like he'd just smile and go. Like he had this sort of duality to him that obviously intrigued me a lot as a writer, and I was curious. I was curious if you think that's right, actually, more importantly, or if you ever got a hint of that.
Yeah, I do think that that is right and a good description. Uh, he knew what was going on and sometimes kind of played that he didn't.
Yeah, yeah, that's maybe a better way of saying it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But of course, with the U-2 incident, he thought that eventually the Russians would shoot down a U-2 plane and that he would be in real trouble for a while.
yeah.
And of course, it postponed a summit meeting he was going to have with the Russian leader. But he was willing to take a chance with the U-2, even though he knew how vulnerable it could be. Yeah.
Russell, thank you so much. I wish I had noted you being on earlier. I would have pulled you in half an hour ago. It's an honor to have you on, sir. And Michelle and Russell, if you like, I could put the two of you in touch with each other via email. If
Oh, I'd love that. I was gonna say I wish I had talked to you 5 years ago when I started this book because it would have been great to like just pick your brain before I said too many stupid things. But yeah, I'd love to talk more.
Could I ask you one quick question?
Yeah,
Did,
please.
did you have any relatives in World War II?
I did. My grandfather was on a destroyer escort in the Pacific, um, and he met my grandmother, who was a wave at a USO event. So I am literally a product of World War II because that is how my grandparents met.
Well, my first platoon sergeant in the 8th Armored Division was named Paradis.
Oh, really?
Yes, and he was, I think, from Maine.
Yeah, that's about right.
And
New
let-
Hampshire, maybe New Hampshire, maybe New Hampshire or Maine. That's where
yes,
my people are. Yeah.
he was badly wounded one night on a patrol in Holland, but his name was Alvary, I believe, G. Paradis.
Yeah.
Uh,
That's wild. That's amazing you can remember that, but that's incredible. But yeah, he's probably, a distant cousin of some, not that even distant. Because my grandfather, and I bet he did too. I'd be interested if you remember any of this. So didn't speak English growing up. So he grew up in what was essentially a French part of New Hampshire, until the war. Like they spoke English. They learned it because it was around, but like even in school he would speak French, and he didn't speak English full time until he went to the Navy at the start of the war. So those are the Paradis who are sort of in northern, yeah, so probably Maine, yeah, Maine, northern New Hampshire. um that's funny.
listen, I will put the two of you in touch because I'm sure there's a great deal, Michelle, more questions, as you say, you would love to ask somebody who actually walked beside the man.
Absolutely, 100%.
And Russell, we're always honored to have you on. Thank you. Scott, thank you for bringing Russell. I see one hand raised, and we probably should limit it to this one last question.
Well,
And then,
I'll say that Rick Weber's been raising his hand, but I'll give the last word to Rick Weber here.
okay, thank
All
you.
right. This is first of all a great program as always. But I just want to mention to you that Warren Goss has returned to D-Day for the 7th time, 100 years old. And the other thing I want to mention is about another World War II gentleman, Henry Parnham, died of all days, July 4th, 2021.
Why?
4 months before his 100th birthday. I have all his information on my wall. Terrific individual. But I have learned so much from this program tonight. As Glenn knows, my favorite general is George C. Marshall. And there's a lot of reasons for it. He had some, but I will say this. I don't think, and George Marshall could have had that job that Eisenhower had. However, because he was so stoic, he would not have been able to do what Eisenhower did. He may have had the tactics, he may have had all the smarts, because they said he was the smartest general, but he didn't have the tact to get along with all those people that Eisenhower did. So they picked the right guy. And I think he was the one that helped pick them because he kind of pushed them down the line. And the other thing was Henry Stinson told President Roosevelt, if he picked him, who's going to take care of MacArthur? Because MacArthur was, Marshall was the only general that MacArthur would listen to.
Yeah.
But I can't wait to get your book. I really can't, because I've learned so much about Eisenhower. And I knew a lot of it, but the Ike part is fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
You know, I think you did a great job researching it, and I think we're all better for it. I know I am, and everybody likes Ike, but to know the man and all of the things that you talked about, getting into it is fantastic. So thank you.
Well, thank you. That's a really kind thing to say. And no, it's super fascinating. And I know we're running late, but absolutely on Marshall, and you hit on it too. And I'll just say this about Roosevelt, because he sensed a lot of what you just said. He's like, Marshall, first of all, is indispensable in Washington, but even more to the point that this is going to be a political job as much as it is a military one. And, Marshall is great at a lot of things, but suffering fools is not one of them. And there's one quote, which is probably basically accurate, that his Roosevelt's son Eliot recounts his father saying, which is, it's not that George Marshall wins it's not that George Marshall argues with Churchill. It's just that he wins every argument. That's the problem, which I thought was very revealing, actually.
Well, the other factor that I know about Marshall is he had a temper.
Yeah, so did Eisenhower. Eisenhower gets away with the smile makes people think Eisenhower is a warming because he.
But they both had their tempers. I'm like Scott Masters, who is very brilliant and does a great job. And so if he ordered the book and Glenn has read it, I think it's got to go on my bucket list. So appreciate it. Thank you.
Great Father's Day gift.
That's right. Just in time for Father's Day.
Well, thank you, Dad.
And the Army birthday. I see your shirt there. So.
Yeah.
I'm going to close with playing this video in the background. Is just so poignant, and just love seeing Eisenhower here with the guys from the 101st Airborne Division. Michel, thank you so very, very much. Justin, I'm sorry we're not going to get to you or anybody else's questions. We've just gone way too long. Scott Masters, thank you. Russell Freeberg, always an honor to have you on. Sean, anything else we need to say other than good night?
No, good night, everybody. Again, next week, look for all of our programs. We'll look forward to seeing you then. Thank you all for joining us.
Yeah.
Look at that.
Thank you all. And thank you for this great organization as well. It's been such a privilege. So thanks so much for inviting me.
We
Absolutely,
hope
Michelle. Thanks for joining us. You're welcome anytime.
Yes.